Chapter 11 of Beyond the Rocks, a love story by Elinor Glyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Amy Deutschler. They were both a little constrained upon the journey back to Versailles, and both felt it. But when they turned into the Porte Saint-Antoine, Theodora woke up. "Do you know," she said, "something tells me that for a long, long time I shall not again have such a happy day. It can't be more than 5:30 or 6. Need we go back to the reservoirs yet? Could we not have tea at the little café by the lake?" He gave the order to his chauffeur, and then he turned to her. "I too want to prolong it all," he said, "and I want to make you happy. Always." "It is only lately that I have begun to think about things," she said softly. "About happiness, I mean, and its possibilities and impossibilities. I think before my marriage I must have been half asleep and very young." And Hector thought, "You are still, but I shall awake you." "You see," she continued, "I had never read any novels or books about life until Jean de Grève, and now I wonder sometimes if it is possible to be really happy, really, really happy." "I know it is," he said, "but only in one way." She did not dare to ask in what way. She looked down and clasped her hands. "I once thought," she went on hurriedly, "that I was perfectly happy the first time Josiah gave me 2,000 francs and told me to go out with my maid and buy just what I wished with it. And oh, we bought everything I could think Sarah and Clementine could want, numbers and numbers of things, and I remember I was fearfully excited when they were sent off to Dieppe, but I never knew if I chose well or if they liked them all quite, and now to do that does not give me nearly so much joy." Soon they drew up at the little café and ordered tea, which he guessed probably would be very bad and they would not drink. But tea was English and more novel than coffee for Theodora, and that she must have, she said. She was so gracious and sweet in the pouring of it out, when presently it came, and the elderly waiter seemed so sympathetic, and it was all gay and bright with the late afternoon sun streaming upon them. "The garçon takes us for a honeymoon couple," Hector said. "He sees you have beautiful new clothes, and that we have not yet begun to yawn with each other." But Theodora had not this view of honeymoons. To her a honeymoon meant a nightmare, now happily a thing of the past, and almost forgotten. "Do not speak of it," she said, and she put her hands as if to ward off an ugly sight, and Hector bent over the table and touched her fingers gently as he said, "Forgive me," and he raged within himself. How could he have been so gauche, so clumsy and unlike himself? He had punished them both, and destroyed an illusion. He meant that she should picture herself and him as married lovers, and she had only seen Josiah Brown. They both fell into silence, and so finished their repast. "I want you to walk now," Hector said, "through some delicious allées, where I will show you Enceladus after he was struck by the thunders of Zeus. You will like him, I think, and there is fine greensward around him where we can sit a while." "I was always sorry for him," said Theodora, "and oh, how I would like to go to Sicily and see Etna, and his fiery breath coming forth, and to know when the island quakes, it is the poor giant turning his weary side. To go to Sicily, and with her!" The picture conjured up in Hector's imagination made him thrill again. Then he told her about it all. He charmed her fancy and excited her imagination, and by the time they came to their goal, the feeling of jar had departed, and the dangerous sense of attraction, of nearness, had returned. It was nearly 7 o'clock, and here among the trees all was in a soft gloom of evening light. "Is not this still and far away?" he said, as they sat on an old stone bench. "I often stay the whole morning here when I can spend a week at Versailles." "How peaceful and beautiful! Oh, I would like a week here too." And Theodora sighed. "You must not sigh, beautiful princess," he implored, "on this our happy day." The slender lines of her figure seemed all drooping. She reminded him more than ever of the fragment of Psyche in the Naples Museum. "No, I must not sigh," she said, "but it seems suddenly to have grown sad, the air. What does it mean? Tell me, you who know so many things." There was a pathos in her voice, like a child in distress. It communicated itself to him, it touched some chords in his nature hitherto silent. His whole being rushed out to her in tenderness. "It seems to me it is because the time grows nearer when we must go back to the world, first to dinner with the others, and then Paris. I would like to stay thus always, just alone with you." She did not refute this solution of her sadness. She knew it was true, and when he looked into her eyes, the blue was troubled with a mist as of coming tears. Then passion, more mightily than ever, seized him once more. He only felt a wild desire to comfort her, to kiss away the mist, to talk to her. "Ah, Theodora," he said, and his voice vibrated with emotion, while he bent forward and seized both her hands, which he lifted to his face. She had not put on her gloves again after the tea, her cool, little, tender hands. He kissed and kissed their palms. "Darling, darling," he said incoherently, "what have I done to make your dear eyes wet? Oh, I love you so, and I have only made you sad." She gave a little inarticulate cry. If a wounded dove could sob, it might have been the noise of a dove so beseechingly and so pathetic. "Oh, please, you must not," she said. "Oh, what have you done? You have killed our happy day." And this was the beginning of his awakening. He sat for many moments with his head buried in his hands. What indeed had he done? And they would be turned out of their Garden of Eden, and all because he was a brute who could not control his passion, but must let it run riot on the first opportunity. He suffered intensely, suffered perhaps for the first time in his life. She had not said one word of anger, only that tone in her voice reached to his heart. He did not move and did not speak, and presently she touched his hands softly with her tender fingers. It seemed like the caress of an angel's wing. "Listen," she said so gently. "Oh, you must not grieve, but it was too good to be true our day. I ought to have known to where we were drifting. I am wicked to have let you say all you have said today. But oh, I was asleep, I think, and I only knew that I was happy. But now you have shown me, and oh, the dream is broken up. Come, let us go back to the world." Then he raised his eyes to her face, and they were haggard and miserable. How her simple speech, blaming herself who was all innocent, touched his heart and filled him with shame at his unworthiness. "Oh, forgive me," he pleaded. "Oh, please forgive me. I am mad, I think. I love you so, and I had to tell you, and yes, I will say it all now, and then you can punish me. From the first moment I looked into your angel eyes, it has been growing. You are so true, and so sweet, and so miles beyond all other women in the world. Each minute I have loved you more, and all the time I thought to win you. Yes, you may well turn away and shrink from me now that you know the brute I am. I thought I would make you love me, and you would forgive me then. But I have suddenly seen your soul, my darling, and I am ashamed. And I can only ask you to forgive me, and let me worship you and be your slave. I will not ask for any return, only to worship you and be your slave, that I may show you I am not all brute, and may earn your pardon. And then Theodora's blindness fell from her, and she knew that she loved him. She had faced the fact at last, and all over her being there thrilled a mad, wild joy. It surged up and crushed out fear and pain for just one moment, and then she too, in her turn, covered her face with her hands. "Oh, hush, hush," she said. "What have you done? What have we both done?" It was characteristic of her that now she realized she loved him, she did not fence any longer. She never thought of concealing it from him or blaming him. They were sinners both, he and she equally guilty. Another woman might have argued, "He is fooling me. Perhaps he has said these things before. I must at least hide my own heart." But not Theodora. Her trust was complete. She loved him, therefore he was a perfect knight, and if he was wicked, she was wicked too. Her gentian eyes were full of tears as she let fall her hands and looked at him. "Oh yes, I have been asleep. I should have known from the beginning why I wanted to see you so much. I should never have come, and I should have understood in the wood that we could not leave it without bringing love with us, and now we may not be happy any more." And then it was his turn to be exalted with wild joy. "Do you know what you have said?" he whispered, breathless. "Your words mean that you love me, Theodora, darling mine." And once again passion blazed in his eyes, and he would have taken her in his arms, but she put up her hands and gently pushed him from her. "Yes," she said simply, "I love you, but that only makes it all the harder, and we must say goodbye at once and go our different ways. You who are so strong and know so much, I trust you, dear. You must help me to do what is right." She never thought of reproaching him or telling him, as she very well could have done, that he had taken cruel advantage of her unsophistication. All her mind was full of the fact that they were both very sad and wicked and must help each other. "I cannot say goodbye," he said, "now that I know you love me, darling. It is impossible. How can we part? What will the days be? How could we get through our lives?" She looked at him, and her eyes were the eyes of a wondrous thing, dumb and pitiful, and asking for help. Then the something that was fine and noble in Hector Bracondale rose up in him. The crust of selfishness and cynicism fell from him like a mask. He suddenly saw himself as he was, and she as she was, and a determination came over him to grow worthy of her love, obey her slightest wish, even if it must break his heart. He dropped upon his knees beside her on the greensward and buried his face in her lap. "Darling, my queen," he said, "I will do whatever you command, but oh, it need not be goodbye. Don't let me sicken and die out of your presence. I swear on my word of honor I will never trouble you. Let me worship you and watch over you and make your life brighter. Oh, God, there can be no sin in that." "I trust you," she said, and she touched the waves of his hair. "And now we must not linger. We must come at once out of this place. I cannot bear it any more." And so they went into an alley of close-cropped trees, where the gloom was almost twilight, but if there was pain, there was joy too, and almost peace in their hearts. All the anguish was for the afterwards. Love, who is a god, was too near to his kingdom to admit of any rival. "Hector," she whispered, and as she said his name a wild thrill ran through him again. "Hector, the Austrian prince at Armenonville said life was a current down which our barks floated, only to be broken up on the rocks if it was our fate. And I said if we tried very hard, some angel would steer us past them into smooth waters beyond. And I want you to help me find the angel, dear, will you?" But all he could say was that she was the angel, the only angel in heaven or earth. And so they came at last to the Maison de Neptune, and on through the side door into the reservoirs, and there was the widow's automobile that moment arrived. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Beyond the Rocks, a love story by Elinor Glyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Amy Deutschler. Everyone behaved with immense propriety. They said just what they should have said. There was no gêne at all. And when they went up the stairs together to arrange their hair and their hats for dinner, the elder woman slipped her arm through Theodora's. "I am going to marry your father, my dear," she said, "and I want you to be the first to wish me joy." The dinner went off with great gaiety. The widow especially was full of bright sayings, and Captain Fitzgerald made the most devoted lover, not too elated by his good fortune, and yet thoroughly happy and tender. He continually told himself that fate had been uncommonly kind to mix business and pleasure so dexterously, for if the widow had not possessed a cent, he still would have been glad to marry her. He had been quite honest with her on their drive, explaining his financial situation and his disadvantages, which he said could only be slightly balanced by his devotion and affection, but of those he would lay the whole at her feet. And the widow had said, "I am old enough just to know what my money is worth, and if you like to put it as a business speculation for me, I consider, in buying the companion for the rest of my life who happens to suit me, I am laying out the sum to my own advantage." After that there was no more to be said, and he had spent his time making love to her like any Romeo of 20, and both were content. All through dinner a certain strange excitement dominated Theodora. She felt there would be more deep emotion yet to come for her before the day should close. How were they going back to Paris? The moon had risen pure and full. She could see it through the windows. The night was soft and warm, and when the last sips of coffee and liqueurs were finished, it was still only 9 o'clock. On an occasion when no personal excitement was stirring Captain Fitzgerald, he probably would have hesitated about approving of Theodora spending the entire evening alone with Lord Bracondale. She was married, it was true, but to Josiah Brown, and Dominic Fitzgerald knew his world. Tonight, however, Neither the widow nor he had outside thoughts beyond themselves. Indeed, Mrs. McBride was so overflowing with joy she had almost a feeling of satisfaction in the knowledge that the others would possibly be happy too, when she thought of them at all. Again she decided the situation for everyone, and again fate laughed. There was no use staying any longer at Versailles, because the park gates were shut, and they could not stroll in the moonlight, but a drive back and a few turns in the Bois with a little supper at Madrid would be a fitting ending to the day. "You must meet us at Madrid at 10:30, she said. "And Dominic," the name came out as if from long habit, "telephone for a table in the Bosquet, numero 3. I like that garçon best. He knows my wants." And so they got into their separate automobiles. "Let us have all the windows down," said Theodora, "to get all the beautiful air. It is such a lovely night." Her heart was beating as it had never beat before. How could she control herself? How keep calm and ordinary during the enchanting drive? Her hands were cold as ice, while flaming roses burned in the white velvet cheeks. And Hector saw it all and understood, and passion surged madly in his veins. For a mile or two there was silence, only the moonlight and the swift rushing through the air, and the wild beating of their hearts. And so they came to the long, dark stretch of wood by St. Cloud, and the devil whispered sophistries, and fate continued to laugh. Then passion was too strong for him. "Darling," he said, and his fine resolutions fled to the winds, while his deep voice was hoarse and broken. "My darling, God, I love you so, beyond all words or sense. Oh, let us be happy for this one night. We must part afterwards, I know, and I will accept that. But just for tonight, there can be no sin and no harm in being a little happy, when we are going to pay for it with all the rest of our lives. Let us have the memory of 1 hour of bliss. The angels themselves could not grudge us that. 1 hour of bliss out of a lifetime. Would it be a terrible sin, Theodora wondered, a terrible, unforgivable sin to let him kiss her, to let him hold her just once in his arms? There was no light in the coupe. He had seen to that. Only the great lamps flaring in the road, and the moonlight. She clasped her hands in an agony of emotion. She was but a dove in the net of an experienced fowler, but she did not know or think of that, nor he either. They only knew they loved each other passionately, and this situation was more than they could bear. "Oh, I trust you," she said. "If you tell me it is not a terrible sin, I will believe you. I do not know. I cannot think. But she could speak no more because she was in his arms. The intense, unutterable joy, the maddening, intoxicating bliss of the next hour, to have her there, unresisting, to caress her lips and eyes and hair, to murmur love words, to call her his very own. Nothing in heaven could equal this, and no hell was a price too great to pay. So it seemed to him. It was the supremest moment of his life, and how much more of hers who knew none other, who had never received the kisses of men or thrilled to any touch but his. After a little she drew herself away and shivered. She knew she was wicked now, very, very wicked, but it was again characteristic of her that having made her decision, there was no vacillation about her. The die was cast. For that night they were to be happy, and all the rest of her life should be penitence and atonement. But tonight there was no room for anything but joy. She had never dreamed in her most secret thoughts of moments so gloriously sweet as these, to have a lover, and such a lover. And it was true, it must be true, that they had lived before, and all this passion was not the growth of one short week. It seemed as if it was all her life, all her being. It could mean nothing now but Hector, Hector, Hector. And over again he made her whisper in his ear that she loved him, nor could she ever tire of hearing him say he worshipped her. Oh, they were foolish and tender and wonderful, as lovers always are. He had given his orders beforehand, and the chauffeur was a man of intelligence. They drove in the most beautiful allée when they came to the Bois, and no incident ruffled the exquisite peace and bliss of their time. Suddenly Hector became aware of the fact it was just upon 10:30, and they were almost in sight of Madrid, which would end it all. And a pang of hideous pain shot through him, and he did not speak. In the distance the lights blazed into the night, and the sight of them froze Theodora to ice. It was finished then, their hour of joy. "My darling," he exclaimed passionately, "goodbye, and remember all my life is in your hands, and I will spend it in worship of you and thankfulness for this hour of yourself you have given to me. I am yours to do with as you will unto death do us part." "And I," said Theodora, "will never love another man, and if we have sinned together. And now, oh Hector, we must face our fates." Her voice tore his very heartstrings in its unutterable pathos. And in that last passionate kiss, it seemed as if they exchanged their very souls. Then they drove into the glare of the restaurant lights, having tasted of the knowledge of good and evil. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Beyond the Rocks, a love story by Elinor Glyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Amy Deutschler. "What have I done? What have I done?" Hector groaned to himself in anguish as he paced up and down his room at the Ritz an hour after the party had broken up, and he had driven Mrs. McBride back in his automobile, leaving hers to father and daughter. All through supper Theodora had sat limp and white as death, and every time she had looked at him her eyes had reminded him of a fawn he had wounded once at Brackendale in the park with his bow and arrow when he was a little boy. He remembered how fearfully proud he had been as he saw it fall, and then how it had lain in his arms and bled, and its tender eyes had gazed at him in no reproach, only sorrow and pain, and a dumb asking why he had hurt it. All the light of the stars seemed quenched. No eyes in the world had ever looked so unutterably pathetic as Theodora's eyes, and gradually, as they sat and talked platitudes and chaffed with the elderly fiancés, it had come to him how cruel he had been, he who had deliberately used every art to make her love him, and now, having gained his end, what could he do for her? What for himself? Nothing but sorrow faced them both. He had taken brutal advantage of her gentleness and innocence, when chivalry alone should have made him refrain. He saw himself as he was, the hunter and she the hunted, and the knowledge that he would pay with all the anguish and regret of a passionate, hopeless love, perhaps for the rest of his life, did not balance things to his awakened soul. If his years should be one long gnawing ache for her, what of hers? And she was so young. His life, at all events, was a free one, but hers tied to Josiah Brown. And this thought drove him to madness. She belonged to Josiah Brown, not to him whom she loved, but to Josiah Brown, plebeian and middle-aged and exacting. He knew now that he ought to have gone away at once, the next day after they had met. His whole course of conduct had been weak and absolutely self-indulgent and wicked. Who was he to dare to have raised his eyes to this angel, and try to scorch even the hem of her clothing? And now he had only brought suffering upon her, and dimmed the light in God's two stars, which were her eyes. And then wild passion shook him, and he could only live again the divine moments when she had nestled unresisting in his arms. Would it have made things better or worse if he had not yielded to the temptation of that hour of night and solitude? After all, the sin was in making her love him, not in just holding her and kissing her lips. And at least, they would have that exquisite memory of moments of unutterable bliss to keep for the rest of their lives. His windows were wide open, and he leaned upon the balcony and gazed out at the moon. What good had all his life been? What benefit had he brought to anyone? Then he seemed to see a clear vision of Theodora's short existence. Every picture she had unconsciously shown him was of some gentle thought of unselfishness for others. And now he had lain a burden upon her shoulders, when he would not hurt a hair of her head, that dear, exquisite head which had lain upon his breast only 2 hours ago and could never lie there again. He knew this was the end. Then anguish and remorse seized him, and he buried his face on his crossed arms. And Theodora staggered up to her room like one half dead. Mercifully, Josiah Brown had gone to bed, leaving a message with Henriette, Theodora's maid, that on no account was she to make any noise or disturb him. Henriette adored her mistress, as who did not who served her, and she felt distressed to see Madame so pale. Doubtless Madame had had a most tiring day. Madame had, and was thankful when at last she was left alone with her thoughts. Then she, too, opened wide the windows and gazed at the moon. She had no cause for remorse for evil conduct like Hector. She had made no plans for the entrapping of any soul, and yet she felt forlorn and wicked. Oh, yes, she was awake now and knew where she had been drifting, and so love had come at last, and indeed, it meant life. This blast had struck her, and she had been blind in not recognizing it at once. But oh, how sweet it was, love, and it seemed as if it could make everything good and fair. If he and she who loved each other could have belonged to each other, surely they might have shed joy and gladness and kindness on all around. Then she lay on her bed, and did not try to reason any more. She only knew she loved Hector Bracondale with all her heart and being, and that she was married to Josiah Brown. And what would the days be when she never saw him? And he, too, he would be sad, and then there was poor Josiah, who was so generous to her. He could not help being vulgar and unsympathetic, and her duty was to make him happy. Well, she could do that. She would try her very best to do that. But thrills ran through her with the recollection of the moments in the drive to Paris. Oh, why had no one told her or warned her all her life about this good thing, love? At last, worn out with all emotions, sleep gently closed her eyes. And fate up above laughed no more. Her sport was over for a time. She had made a sorry ending to their happy day. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Beyond the Rocks, a love story by Elinor Glyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Amy Deutschler. Josiah had been much too fatigued on his machinery hunt with Mr. Clutterbuck R. Tubbs. They had lunched too richly, he said, and stood about too long, and so all the Sunday he was peevish and fretful, and required Theodora's constant attention. She must sit by his bedside all the morning, and drive round and round all the afternoon. He told her she was not looking well. These excursions did not suit either of them, and he would be glad to get to England. He asked a few questions about Versailles, and Theodora vouchsafed no unnecessary information. Nor did she tell him of her father's good fortune. The widow had expressly asked her not to. She wished it to appear in the New York Herald first of all, she said, and they could have a regular rejoicing at the banquet on Monday night. Men are all bad, she had told Theodora during their ante-dinner chat. Selfish brutes, most of them, but nature has arranged that we happen to want them, and it is not for me to go against nature. Your father is a gentleman, and he keeps me from yawning, and I have enough money to be able to indulge that and whatever other caprices I may have acquired. So I think we shall be happy. But a man in the abstract don't amount to much. And Theodora had laughed. But now she wondered if she ever would think it was true. Would Hector ever appear in the light of a caprice she could afford? To keep her from yawning? Could she ever truly say, he don't amount to much? Alas, he seemed now to amount to everything in the world. The unspeakable flatness of the day, the weariness, the sense of all being finished. She did not even allow herself to speculate as to what Hector was doing with himself. She must never let her thoughts turn that way at all if she could help it. She must devote herself to Josiah and to getting through the time. But something had gone out of her life which could never come back, and also something had come in. She was awake. She, too, had lived for one moment like in Jean de Grève, and it seemed as if the whole world were changed. Captain Fitzgerald did not appear all day, so the Sunday was composed of unadulterated Josiah. But it was only when Theodora was alone at last late at night, and had opened wide her windows and again looked out on the moon, that a little cry of anguish escaped her, and she remembered she would see Hector tomorrow at the dinner party. See him casually, as the rest of the guests, and this is how it would be forever and ever. Lord Bracondale had passed what he termed a dog's day. He had gone racing, and there had met and been bitterly reproached by Esclarmonde de Chartres for his neglect. Qu'est-ce qu'il a eu pour toute une semaine? He had important business in England, he said, and was going off at once, but she would find the bracelet she had wished for waiting for her at her apartment, and so they parted friends. He felt utterly revolted with all that part of his life. He wanted nothing in the world but Theodora to worship and cherish and hold for his own, and each hour that came made all else seem more empty and unmeaning. Just before dinner he went into the widow's sitting room. She was alone, Marie had said in the passage, resting, she thought, but Madame would certainly see Milord. She had given orders for him to be admitted should he come. "Now sit down near me, beau jeune homme," Mrs. McBride commanded from the depths of her sofa, where she was reclining, arrayed in exquisite billows of chiffon and lace. "I have been expecting you. It is not because I have been indulging in a little sentiment myself that my eyes are glued shut. You have a great deal to confess, and I hope we have not done too much harm between us." Hector wanted sympathy, and there was something in the widow's directness which he felt would soothe him. He knew her good heart. He could speak freely to her, too, without being troubled by an over-delicacy of mauvaise honte, as he would have been with an Englishwoman. It would not have seemed sacrilege to the widow to discuss with him, who was a friend, the finest and most tender sentiments of her own, or anyone else's, heart. He drew up a bergère and kissed her hand. "I have been behaving like a damned scoundrel," he said. "My gracious!" exclaimed Mrs. McBride, with a violent jerk into a sitting position. "You don't say!" Then, for the first time for many years, a deep scarlet blush overspread Hector's face, even up to his forehead, as he realized how she had read his speech, how most people of the world would have read it. He got up from his chair and walked to the window. "Oh, good God!" he said. "I don't mean that." The widow fell back into her pillows with a sigh of relief. "I mean I have deliberately tried to make her unhappy, and I have succeeded, and myself too." "That is not so bad, then," and she settled the cushion, "because unhappiness is only a thing for a time. You are crazy for the moon, and you can't get it, and you grieve and curse for a little, and then a new moon arises. What else?" "Well, I want you to sympathize with me, and tell me what I had better do. Shall I go back to England tomorrow morning, or stay for the dinner party?" "You got as far, then, as telling each other you loved each other madly, and are both suffering from broken hearts, after 1 week's acquaintance." "Don't be so brutal," pleaded Hector. And she noticed that his face looked haggard and changed, so her shrewd, kind eyes beamed upon him. "Yes, I dare say it hurts, but having broken up your cake, you can't go on eating it. Why in heaven's name did you let affairs get to a climax?" "Because I am mad," said Hector, and he stretched out his arms. "I cannot tell you how much I love her. Haven't you seen for yourself what a darling she is? Every dear word she speaks shows her beautiful soul, and it all creeps right into my heart. I worship her as I might an angel, but I want her in my arms." Mrs. McBride knew the English. They were not emotional or poseur like some other nations, and Hector Bracondale was essentially a man of the world, and rather a whimsical cynic as well. So to see him thus moved might mean great things. She was guilty, too, for helping to create the situation. She must do what she could for him, she felt. "You should pull yourself together, mon cher Bracondale," she said. "It is not like you to be limp and undecided. You had better stay for the party and make yourself behave like a gentleman, and how you mean to continue. We have passed the days when, oh no, we never mention him, is the order, and never meeting, and that sort of thing. You are bound to meet unless you go into the wilds, and you must face it and try to forget her." "I can never forget her," he said in a deep voice. "But as you say, I must face it and do my best." "You see," continued the widow, "the girl has only been married a year, and her husband is the most unattractive human being you could find along a sidewalk of miles. But he is her husband anyway, and she may have children." Hector clenched his hands in a convulsive moment of anguish and rage. "And you must realize all these possibilities, and settle a path for yourself and stick to it." "Oh, I couldn't bear that," he said. "It would be better I should take her away myself now, today." "You will do no such thing," said the widow sternly, and she sat up again. You forget I am going to marry her father, and I shall look upon her as my daughter and protect her from wolves. Do you hear? And what is more, she is too good and true to go with you. She has a backbone if you haven't, and she'll see it her duty to stick to that lump of middle-class meat she is bound to, and she'll do her best if she suffers to heartbreak. It is she, the poor little white dove that you and I have wounded between us, that I pity, not you, great strong man." Mrs. McBride's eyes flashed. "Oh, you are all the same, you Englishmen. Beasts to kill and women to subjugate, the only aims in life."
"Don't," said Hector. "I am not the animal you think me. I worship Theodora, and I would devote my life and its best aims to secure her happiness and do her honor. But don't you see you have drawn a picture that would drive any man mad? I said you had to face the worst, and I calculate the worst for you would be to see her with some little Browns along. My, how it makes you wince! Well, face it then, and be a man." He sat for a moment, his head buried in his hands. Then, "I will," he said. "I will do what I can. But oh, when you have the chance, you will be good to her. Won't you, dear friend?"
"There, there," said the widow, and she patted his hand. "I had to scold you, because I see you have got the attack very badly, and only strong measures are any good. But you know I am sorry for you both, and I feel dreadfully, because I helped you to it without enough thought as to consequences." There was silence for a few minutes, and she continued to stroke his hand. "Dominic has run down to Dieppe to see those daughters of his," she said presently, "and won't be back tonight. I mean to be all alone and meditate and go to bed early. But you can dine with me if you wish up here, and we will talk everything over. Our plans for the future, I mean, and what will be best to do. I kind of feel like your mother-in-law, you know." Which sentence comforted him. This woman was his friend, and so kind of heart, if sometimes a little plain-spoken. And late that night he wrote to Theodora. "My darling," he began. "I must call you that, even though I have no right to. My darling, I want to tell you these my thoughts tonight, before I see you tomorrow as an ordinary guest at your dinner party. I want you to know how utterly I love you, and how I am going to do my best with the rest of my life to show you how I honor you and revered you as an angel, and something to live for, and shape my aims to be worthy of the recollection of that hour of bliss you granted me. Dearest love, does it not give you joy, just a little, to remember those moments of heaven? I do not regret anything, though I am all to blame, for I knew from the beginning I loved you and just where love would lead us. But it was not until I saw the peep into your soul, when you never reproached me, that I began to understand what a brute I had been, how unworthy of you or your love. Darling, I don't ask you to try and forget me. Indeed, I implore you not to do so. I think and believe you are of the nature which only loves once in a lifetime, and I am world-worn and experienced enough to know I have never really loved before. How passionately I do now I cannot put into words, so let us keep our love sacred in our hearts, my darling, and the knowledge of it will comfort and soothe the anguish of separation. Beloved one, I am always thinking of you, and I want to tell you my vision of heaven would be to possess you for my wife. My happiest dream will always be that you are there at Bracondale, queen of my home and my heart, darling. My darling! But however it may be, whether you decide to chase away every thought of me or not, I want you to know I will go on worshiping you and doing my utmost to serve you with my life. Forever and ever, your devoted lover. And then he signed it Hector, and not Bracondale.
The widow had promised to give it into Theodora's own hand on the morrow. He added a postscript. I want you to meet my mother and my sister in London. Will you let me arrange it? I think you will like Anne. And oh, more than all I want you to come to Bracondale. Write me your answer, that I may have your words to keep always. Mrs. McBride came round in the morning to the private hotel in the Avenue du Bois to ask the exact time of the dinner party, she said. She wanted to see for herself how things were going, and the look in Theodora's eyes grieved her. I am afraid it has gone rather deeply with her, she mused. Now what can I do? Theodora was unusually sweet and gentle, and talked brightly of how glad she was for her father's happiness and of their plans about England, but all the time Jane McBride was conscious that the something which had made her eyes those stars of gracious happiness was changed. Instead, there was a deep pathos in them, and it made her uncomfortable. I wish to goodness I had let well alone, and not tried to give her a happy day, she said to herself. Just before leaving, she slipped Hector's letter into Theodora's hand. Lord Bracondale asked me to give you this, my child, she said, and she kissed her. And if you will write the answer, will you post it to him to the Ritz? All over Theodora there rushed an emotion when she took the letter. Her hands trembled, and she slipped it into the bodice of her dress. She would not be able to read it yet. She was waiting, already dressed, for Josiah to enter any moment to take their usual walk in the Bois. Then she wondered what would the widow think of her action, slipping it into her dress. But it was done now, and too late to alter, and their eyes met, and she understood that her future stepmother was wide awake and knew a good many things. But the kind woman put her arm round her and kissed her soft cheek. I want you to be my little daughter, Theodora, she said. And if you have a heartache, dear, why, I have had them too, and I'd like to comfort you. There. End of chapter 14.